It's Sunday, but this is a Sunday Reads instead of a Friday Reads. I traveled on Thursday. Didn't do much reading on Thursday or Friday, but I did read yesterday, and I've kind of been waiting for a moment of calm to be able to film here. I am, of course, at my parents' place, different background, and everybody has either gone to church or to work, so I have the place to myself, so I decided I would film. I made a pot of tea in my strawberry teapot back there. So this is kind of a joint, what I'm reading, what I've read, as well as my ShakeTube video, because I did indeed read Taming of the Shrew, which was the first work in the ShakeTube readathon. I'll show you the Shakespeare first. I waited to read the Shakespeare until I got back here to my parents' place, because this is where my Shakespeare volumes are. I have a collection of his works, the complete works, in these little red editions. From what I understand, they're from the late 1800s, early 1900s, something like that. My grandfather gave them to me. I believe they belonged to someone in his family that had given them to him. So they've been passed down for a couple generations here. They're beautiful little books, quite small to hold in the hands. As you can see, they're pretty tiny because my own hand completely covers the cover. So Taming of the Shrew is the last work in here. And I have to admit, I'm more partial to Shakespeare's tragedies and his histories than I am to his comedies. Taming of the Shrew was okay. There is, of course, a framing device. We have Sly, who is a drunkard. And he falls down drunk and passes out, and this lord decides to play a joke on him, takes him back to his fancy manor, puts him in his bed, has a page boy dress up as a woman, and when he wakes up they convince him that he is a lord who has been dreaming or hallucinating for the past years. And then they tell him that a group of players have arrived to entertain him, and the Taming of the Shrew is the play that the players put on. It is assumed by some that the ending of the play was lost because Shakespeare never returns to this drunkard and to this trick that has been played on him. The play simply ends at the end of the play that the players are putting on. I wasn't all that entertained. I mean, it was okay. I read it. It was pretty easy to understand. But for a comedy, I wasn't laughing that much. I think the only scene that really got me laughing a little bit was when Katharina's husband tells her that the sun is the moon. She disagrees with him at first, and then he teaches her obedience. And she consents to his perspective and says that if he believes the sun is the moon, then the sun is the moon. So that was a funny scene, but apart from that, I don't know, I typically like Shakespeare, but Taming of the Shrew just didn't do it for me. Yeah, so that was the first Shakespeare I read. I wish I had more to say about it, but I've watched a bunch of videos so far for the ShakeTube on Taming of the Shrew, and I don't want to be that person who repeats everything else that everyone else has already said. So maybe next time I should film before I watch everyone else talk about it, because I feel like everything to say has been said, apart from me saying that it's not my favorite Shakespeare. So in addition to Taming of the Shrew, let me retrieve my tea. I read Revolution for the Hell of It by Abbie Hoffman yesterday. It's one that's on my bookshelf here at my parents' place. I've read it once or twice before, I think. The last time would have been 2013 or something like that. Abbie Hoffman was an American anti-war activist. This was published in '68, and it's sort of a memoir, sort of a manual, sort of a collection of essays. I don't know, it's hard to say. The chapters deal with different things. It's somewhat chronological. He does a lot of really funny things. He did a lot of really funny things in the name of activism. One of them was to levitate the Pentagon. He got a bunch of people, well, he and a bunch of people got together and they measured the Pentagon, planned a protest where people would surround the Pentagon, and they intended to levitate it in the name of exorcising the evil spirits that were causing the war, I suppose. It was a piece of performance art, of course, to draw awareness to, I think, the absurdity, to the absurdity of the war, to the absurdity of society. Abbie Hoffman is known as a yippie or an anarchist, sometimes just as a hippie, as an activist. He was an interesting character, I think, and even though my politics don't really align with his methods, I find him incredibly fascinating to read about. And I've read this one and another book by him called Steal This Book, and a couple of other ones by and about him. This would have been a couple years ago now that I read those. But as I said, he recounts when they plan to levitate the Pentagon, and I'm going to see if I can find the chapter in here where they do that. Here we go. Page 43. Flashback. 67, 68, 69, 70. What do you think you guys are doing? Measuring the Pentagon. We have to see how many people will need to form a ring around it. You're what? It's very simple. You see, the Pentagon is a symbol of evil in most religions. You're religious, aren't you? Uh-huh. Well, the only way to exorcise the evil spirits here is to form a circle around the Pentagon. 87, 88, 89. The two scouts are soon surrounded by a corps of guards, FBI agents, soldiers, and some mighty impressive brass. 112, 113, 114. Are you guys serious? It's against the law to measure the Pentagon. Are you guys serious? Show us the law. 237, 238, 239, 240. That does it. Colonel, how much is 240 times 5? What? What the hell's going on here? 1200, answers Bruce, and an impressive-looking agent who tells us later he works in a security department that doesn't even have a name yet. We show them our exorcism flyers. They bust us for littering. Shades of Alice's restaurant. Are you guys kidding? That ain't litter, it's art. Litter, art, litter. How about litter art, says Bruce after 2 hours. We are free to go, but have to be very sneaky and ditch Bruce somewhere inside the Pentagon maze so he won't find the Acapulco gold in our car. So that was probably one of the most famous anti-war protests organized by the yippies. Abbie Hoffman also recounts tossing money into the New York Stock Exchange over the railing. There's a great chapter in here called The Charge of the Flower Brigade, in which they march through the streets holding flowers, being given flowers. They end up near a Boy Scout troop. And the Boy Scouts are forced to leave because they feel that it's inappropriate, it's dangerous for them to be near all these hippies with flowers. Abbie Hoffman did a lot of street theater, running a pig for president, or attempting to anyway. Some great pictures in here. And then you get to the end where he's essentially telling you ways to get free things. His morals are questionable. He suggests stealing, that sort of thing, deceiving people. And even though I don't agree with his methods or with his politics, as I said, he is incredibly entertaining to read. In addition to Revolution for the Hell of It, I read most of 1967 by Pierre Berton yesterday. 1967, Canada's Turning Point, a chronicle of Canada's centennial year. So this is a book in which Pierre Berton covers everything from the centennial celebrations to the Expo 67 to social and political changes to sports. For instance, he does a little section on hockey. 1967, he says, was the last year where Canada had control of the NHL in the sense that there were more hockey teams in Canada than in the United States. 1967, he says, was also the last year that the Toronto Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup. So it's been 50 years since the Toronto Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup. 50 years since the NHL was mostly a Canadian organization. He talks about the Confederation train, which was a government project. The cars were basically a museum, and it traveled across the country from Vancouver, I believe, out to the East Coast. And it would stop in select communities, and people would line up for hours and hours to get a glimpse of these museum cars, which told the story of Canada's history as the government saw it at the time. You had world leaders visiting. Burton recounts the time that the American president came. Now, the American president initially said that he was too busy to come. And then on very short notice, he announced he was coming and told Canada to be ready for him. They decided to put him up in a cottage. And the FBI agent spent hours combing the bushes around the property. Pierre Berton suggests that the RCMP could have done just as good a job in a shorter amount of time, and that the FBI didn't need to do that. And then the Canadian Prime Minister arrives at this cottage. The American president isn't there yet, I don't believe. But he arrives at the cottage, he's got to use the washroom, he heads up the stairs. At the top of the stairs, he is stopped by an FBI agent who says, "Who are you?" And the Prime Minister says, "This is my house, I have to use the washroom." So there was that incident. Not as dramatic or as much of an international incident as when de Gaulle from France came to visit. He showed up in Montreal and was essentially kicked out by the Canadian government after some comments. He said, I think it was "Vive le Montreal, vive le Quebec." Let me see if I can find it specifically. Basically, yeah, here we go. "Vive Montreal, vive le Quebec, vive le Quebec libre." Long live Quebec liberty, Quebec independence. De Gaulle basically came into Canada, came into Quebec, and gave a rallying cry that was being used by Quebec separatists. And so the government, politely or perhaps not so politely, asked him to leave because tensions were quite high at that time. It was the 1960s. You had the bombing of mailboxes by the separatists, the destruction of anything that had symbols of the crown on it. 1967 was just a few short years away from the October crisis of 1970, where a Quebec cabinet minister and a British diplomat were kidnapped. Yeah, so tensions were pretty high at that point, and you have de Gaulle coming in, and he claims he didn't know what he was doing, but you have de Gaulle coming in and essentially supporting the separatists, supporting the FLQ terrorists. So yeah, you have that, and then you have other interesting stories in here, like the group of men who decided they were going to canoe from Manitoba, I believe, to Montreal. And I believe it's still on record as the longest canoe race ever recorded. You have a community that decided they were going to build a UFO landing pad as their centennial project. You have a community that got together on New Year's Eve to bring in the new year by burning all the outhouses in a giant bonfire, because this was a fairly remote community and they had just recently put in a sewage system, and so all the old outhouses were now useless, and they wanted to kind of celebrate the future, celebrate leaving certain aspects of the past behind. So it's a very interesting book in that regard. Burton also touches on how this time period in the 60s, set the spark for the beginning of the gay rights and gay pride movement, set the spark for the women's rights movement. You have the beginning of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in Canada. It's just a very interesting book in that regard. Lots of different snapshots about different social and political and cultural aspects of Canada in 1967. So that is what I've been reading. I'm not sure what I'm going to be reading next. Probably just something random I pull off my shelf. I may film another video while I'm here, I may not. I am going home on Thursday, and I'm not sure if I'm going to have the opportunity to sit alone for an hour, as I have now, and film